Modern monkeys talk about monkey sailors and why evolution isn't being taught in the science classrooms. This is Genesis Week. And a big welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy, made possible by you, the supporters of Core Ottawa, Citizens for Origins Research and Education. Excellence in pirate broadcasting. We continue to bring you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear, and we give glory to our creator while doing it. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, you can just punch in genesisweek.com, where you can find us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and get extras like Crevo rants and full interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. A paper in Science magazine discusses the ramifications of the oldest monkey fossils ever found in South America. These fossil monkeys, dated at 35 million Darwin years, have a lot of resemblance to fossil monkeys of the same alleged age in Africa. And of course, all the monkeys are supposed to have come from Africa originally, so the evolutionary researchers speculated as to just how on earth those monkeys got over from Africa, because the supercontinent, Pangaea, would have broken up by that point. Now, you probably remember Pangaea from school. The idea that all of the continents were once joined together into a supercontinent, which was given the name Pangaea. Interestingly, this idea actually came from the Bible. A guy by the name of Snyder Pellegrini was reading his Bible, where in Genesis it states that, "And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so." He said to himself, if the water was in one place, then it makes sense that the land was also in one place. The land is in all different places now, presumably that happened during the flood. So he began to piece together the continents, experimenting with perhaps how they were joined together. This was some 50 years before the idea of plate tectonics, a concept which basically hijacked a biblical idea, slapped on millions of years to it, and called it proof that the Bible was wrong, because clearly this took millions of years and the Bible says the earth was only 6,000 years old. Snyder Pellegrini was decades ahead of his time, being a creationist who read his Bible. That Bible was thousands of years ahead of its time. But this brings up a common question from Bible critics. After the flood of Noah, how did the kangaroos get to Australia? Now, most creationary scientists would argue that the continents divided during the flood of Noah. So the question applies to all of life, actually. How did the animals get to all the different continents? The anti-theists like to argue that the kangaroos evolved in Australia, so they believe they have an explanation, but we do not, so therefore the Bible must be incorrect. So isn't it interesting how the tables have turned with new discovery by evolutionary scientists of these fossil monkeys? According to their Darwinian timescale, which I disagree with, the continents were already divided by this point, but yet those monkeys somehow got from Africa to South America. Their solution? Rafting monkeys. That's right, monkeys somehow rafted from Africa to South America. Now, I'm not personally aware of any observations of monkeys rafting the Atlantic nowadays, other than as pirates' pets, which is in itself an interesting proposition. But my point is this: if monkeys somehow rafted from Africa to South America, why is it so hard to believe that kangaroos, getting off Noah's Ark in the Middle East, somehow rafted to Australia? The rafting that the kangaroos would have to do would be less than half of the 2,000-mile distance the monkeys would have to raft. But coming back to our pirates with their pet monkeys and parrots, because the anti-theists, and in the case of these specific evolutionary scientists as well, are stuck in an evolutionary mindset. In their worldview, humans were not around yet. They had not yet evolved. Within the creationary worldview, we have no problem with people bringing animals across entire oceans as pets, and thus releasing them into their new worlds. However, there's also an even simpler solution which again confounds the evolutionary worldview. When we look under the oceans, we find mountains under the ocean which have been planed off flat by wave action. They call these mountains table mounts, and some of the table mounts have been planed off thousands of feet below what is now sea level. So obviously the oceans were, for at least a time, thousands of feet lower than they are today. Well, let's take a look at what our continents would look like if we lowered the oceans by even 100 meters or 300 feet. With the exception of Australia and Antarctica, you could walk to literally any continent on Earth. Think about it. If you were migrating from the landing site of Noah's Ark in Turkey and walked 5 miles per day, 5 miles, that's it. In 5 years, you could relocate you and your family and all of your animals to what is now Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. The anti-theorists apparently do not recognize their own contradictions, as they too believe these land bridges existed, yet according to their timescale, the land bridges existed for millions of years, instead of perhaps a few hundred years, according to creationary thinkers. So the anti-theists have not challenged creationists at all with their questions of how did the kangaroos get to Australia? Because even their own worldview has monkeys rafting across the Atlantic without human intervention, and they too believe that there was land bridges connecting every continent on Earth except for Australia and Antarctica. And even amongst those of the deep time worldview, there is a belief that there was land bridges connecting even Australia and Antarctica. It was Sir Charles Lyell who coined the term "the present is the key to the past." He was secretly trying to undermine the Bible with this catchphrase, as the Bible is the key to the past. The Bible obviously has answers to the past. I wonder what it says about the future. Wonder what it says about your future. Last week we talked about how our education system has so many deep-rooted issues when it comes to teaching evolution, specifically with regards to accuracy in fact. This past week, an entire issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science was devoted to the politics of science. A good majority of the papers were trying to figure out why the public tends to reject status quo science. The study was inspired by the rejection of what they deemed solid science, like global warming and evolution, and the reaction of the public and politicians towards these hot-button topics and other topics like stem cell research. The study was focused on American science and politics, but the conclusions are certainly applicable to other countries like Canada. They discovered that both liberal and conservative peoples would reject the science. They would just reject different conclusions, apparently based on their liberal or conservative leaning. There was a barrage of articles within the science reporting world taking away their own interpretation of the study's results. Jeffrey Mervis wrote 2 articles, one for Science magazine In Depth, and another for Science magazine's Science Insider. The first in-depth article also betrays Mervis's misunderstanding of what science is. How ironic he's writing for Science magazine. With the title, Why Many U.S. Biology Teachers Are Wishy-Washy, and starts it off with, when 2 political scientists asked a group of U.S. college students preparing to become biology teachers about their views on evolution, they were shocked by the answers. I'm, pretty ignorant on this topic. Is there enough of scientific evidence to say for sure? Mervis was quoting from one of the papers in the Annals written by Berkman and Plutzer, who labeled new high school biology teachers enablers of doubt. They're talking about evolution, of course, and this study springboards from a previous study they conducted back in 2007, where they concluded that half of high school biology teachers did a lousy job of teaching evolution in their classroom. They wanted to know why, and were inspired to conduct this second study. In the second study, they concluded that the teachers lacked conviction about evolution and thus avoided the subject. Berkman whined in an interview with Matt Swayne for a Penn State newsletter, If you don't have confidence in your own self-knowledge, especially in a controversial topic, your tendency is going to be to shy away from it, to avoid controversy, and to not really teach the subject, said Berkman. He considered this a major hurdle to getting evolution taught in the high school classroom, and through his own admission, influencing public opinion on evolution. Isn't it interesting? He's looking ahead to influencing politics and public opinion by swaying what is taught in the science classroom. He further whines about the consequences of evolution not being taught the way he likes. You don't have to necessarily prove an alternate theory, you just have to shed sufficient doubt on the prevailing scientific consensus, said Berkman. This is not an original idea. A variety of people and groups use the strategy of enabling doubt in terms of doubting evolution or climate change, or even in the past with tobacco research. Once again, Berkman, amongst all these other authors, has demonstrated his lack of this understanding of science. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Hello! A major scientific principle is called falsification. You really cannot prove something scientifically. You can only disprove something. This is not a matter of doubt. This is a matter of evolution being disproven so many times that it would take many libraries of books to document the cases. And obviously, prevailing scientific consensus does not make a scientific fact, because it's amazing how many of the falsifications falsified the scientific consensus. In response to our Disproof is Proof, What a Country episode, which aired a couple of weeks ago, Kevin Lane tweeted a profound satire making this point exactly. This new discovery will require us to, yet again, rewrite a portion of gravitational theory, said no physicist ever. His satirical point being, how many times have you heard something like this said about evolutionary theory? Multiple times. Every single week. That is because evolution is not science. Science is observable, repeatable, predictable, measurable. Evolution is none of these things. What observations have been made? What tests have been run, seeing as how evolution occurred in the unobservable past? These authors, continuing to use that word science, parrot ye old scientific consensus card again. Obviously, they are implying that if one does not believe the scientific consensus, then they must not be a very scientific person. In fact, we might as well call them anti-science. Well, hold on now. Conveniently, these researchers all brought up global warming as an example of some science that people doubt. I like the way Dewald Jones said it on the excellent website scienceagainstevolution.org in his article, Wrong All Along. If more scientists believe it now, that must mean fewer scientists believed climate played a role in the past. Given the view that anyone who doesn't believe the consensus isn't a real scientist, does the fact that they did not agree with current consensus, if that is in fact the current consensus, mean that they weren't real scientists then? If anybody who doesn't believe in evolution isn't a real scientist, does that mean that anyone who doesn't believe in a particular evolutionary mechanism isn't a real scientist? Indeed, let's take it a step further. In the 70s, the scientific consensus was that there was a coming global cooling, with warnings of doom for the upcoming new ice age. Now the scientific consensus is allegedly global warming. So, was the scientific consensus in the past wrong? If so, then obviously scientific consensus has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not something is scientifically true. So perhaps the reason high school biology teachers are hesitant to teach evolution is because of reasonable doubts that they have about biological evolution. In the last show, I discussed numerous errors in the Ontario school science curriculum regarding evolution. In response, Bill Irwin wrote in on our Facebook page. Hi Ian, why don't you go to the Ontario legislature and give them your thoughts on real science? Well, thanks for writing in, Bill. It's interesting you brought this up because there was actually a rather large section I cut out of the show due to time constraints. We have brought up the real science with the Ontario legislature. This was done 20 years ago. Creationists in Ontario had corresponded with the Ontario Ministers of Education, pointing out errors in the evolution section of the science textbooks used here in Ontario, such as the ones I brought up on the last show. These scientists did not try to introduce creationary teachings of any kind, but simply tried to correct the incorrect, horribly outdated or outright fraudulent teachings in the textbooks. The then Minister of Education and consultants initially agreed they would remove or correct these points. After stalling for literally years, there was a provincial election and another party and another Minister of Education took over. The recommendations were then passed on to an anonymous consulting group who rejected all of the recommendations and put the erroneous and even fraudulent teachings right back into the science textbooks. Fraudulent teachings such as Haeckel's embryos. Any science educators recognize this drawing? How many of you educators knew that this was a known fraud? Haeckel even admitted within 2 years of publishing this drawing in 1868 that it was completely fabricated. This drawing was a known fraud for over 120 years at the time the creationary scientists were calling upon the then Ontario government to remove the fraud. Why were known frauds included in the evolution section of the science textbooks? The names of the consulting group who rejected the recommendations and recommended leaving in the numerous fraudulent information in the science textbooks have never been made public. Who are these mystery people? Why has the Ministry of Education continued for decades to include errors in the science curriculum in order to teach evolution? Does evolution not have any real evidence to stand on, perhaps? That they must resort to false and even fraudulent teaching to prop up evolutionary theory? That is propaganda, not education. That secret consulting group was probably composed of people who have an agenda, like the authors of the ANNALS paper, who even admit their agenda as well as their clear misunderstandings on what science even is. Stick around, we'll be back in 1 minute.
The Complete Creation video series is just that, an exhaustive look at the science, philosophy, and theology behind the creation-evolution debate. In this 12-DVD series, Ian Juby starts off with a 1-hour presentation for the children in God's little creation. He then follows up with almost 11 hours of lecturing for the adults as he walks you through the debate starting at its surprising history and examining the evidence from biology, geology, physics, paleontology, and archaeology. Chances are any question you have about the creation-evolution debate is answered in this video series. With open captions for the hearing impaired, the series is both entertaining and educational. There are also free resources, such as question and answer and proctor sheets for homeschoolers. You can now get the entire set as an instant digital download or on DVD. Visit Ian's bookstore today.
Woohoo! Mail for me? I was accosted by a couple of evolutionary geneticists on YouTube challenging my claims both on Genesis Week and in Crevo Rant number 181, So You Think You're a Chimp, where I discussed the genetic dissimilarities between chimps and humans. I had referred to orphan genes, which was a play on the acronym ORF for Open Reading Frame. Orphan genes are genes which are unique to an organism. No other organism has these genes. This is a huge problem for evolution because every step of one organism evolving into another has to produce an estimated hundreds to thousands of brand spanking new genes. To call this an increase in information is an understatement. To make a crude analogy, this is like a computer having a crash and somehow as a result of the crash, inserting an entire subroutine into the program. Hundreds of times. What's especially interesting is that orphan genes are most often associated with the development of the brain and testicles, two rather important parts of the higher organisms, seeing as how the lack of either one would mean the extinction of the species. Of course, there might be an evolutionary connection after all, as orphan genes affect both, and men tend to think with either one interchangeably. YouTuber Ruhif posted multiple responses such as, and please provide a source for humans having hundreds of orphan genes. Please, please, please let it be Demuth 2006. Well, thanks for writing in, but frankly, your questions surprised me. You're obviously very knowledgeable in genetics. This is common knowledge. You want me to provide a source? There's more sources than I can count. However, let's take a look at some of the history, because this is an interesting discussion. Back in 2007, Lander et al. Wrote about 1,177 specific orphan genes in humans. Pay close attention to what they said. The remaining 1,177 cases were declared to be orphans because they lack orthology, pyrology, or homology to known genes and are not obvious artifacts. If the orphans represent valid human protein coding genes, we would have to conclude that the vast majority of orphans were born after the divergence from chimpanzee. Such a model would require a prodigious rate of gene birth in mammalian lineages and a ferocious rate of gene death, erasing the huge number of genes born before the divergence from chimpanzee. Now, what they're saying here is not just that evolution could not explain the arrival of brand spanking new genes in humans, but also the complete disappearance of genes found in the chimp, which was supposed to be our nearest relative. Now, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of each of these genes. Note well what they say next. We reject such a model as wholly implausible. I completely agree. We thus conclude that the majority of orphans are simply randomly occurring orphs that do not represent protein coding genes. Notice that they then reject all of these orphan genes simply on the basis that evolution could not produce them. What's even more interesting is their plea to non-protein coding genes. Now, for the sake of viewers, there's essentially two kinds of genes. Ones that act directly in producing proteins in the body, and other non-coding genes, which at that time made up about 98% of our DNA. Evolutionists had originally given this non-coding DNA the term junk DNA, thinking it was useless, leftover DNA from our evolutionary ascent. Then, in 2012, the ENCODE project revealed the results from its study and showed that the majority, if not all, of that non-encoding DNA had purpose. So suddenly Lander and team could no longer relegate these 1,177 orphan genes as useless coincidentals, as apparently they all had purpose. Roof also wrote into our email, "Hi Ian, I've noticed that much of the Q&A on Genesis Week of late has been answering softball questions, and I'm not sure whether you are just attracting a certain level of detractors or whether you are being highly selective in what you put on the show. So please humor me and try to answer a legitimate criticism. Several times you referred to a claim that the chimpanzee genome is 12% longer than the human genome, and I've asked you several times for a source. I've attached a chromosome by chromosome breakdown of recent versions of the respective genomes, and you'll see that the human genome is actually a little bit bigger than the chimpanzee genome. Please put this 12% myth to bed." Again, I'm surprised by your question, as this was common knowledge. I made this point in response to the fallacious claim that chimp and human DNA were 98.4% identical. Ruhif is correct in saying that I've pointed out how the chimp genome is bigger for many years. As I've spoken on the subject over the past 20 years or so, the figure I used has changed considerably. These numbers were all provided by the evolutionists themselves. The number varied wildly between 10% and 20% over the years, and was a specific claim about the number of base pairs in the strand of DNA. For example, in 2004, Voet and Voet wrote that the human DNA was 3.2 billion base pairs, while the chimpanzee was 3.6 billion. That's a difference of 12% right there. When the human and chimpanzee genomes were finally decoded, even then the total base pair count varied, depending on who you asked, though the majority acknowledged that the chimp DNA was longer than the human. Ruhif referenced the DNA databases which he had downloaded. I too had the most recent downloads of the DNA databases, and even just looking at the file size difference between the human and chimp 2-bit files, you can see the chimp database is about 4% larger. On the NIH website, there are 15 different human DNA databases to choose from, some complete, some incomplete. There are 4 different chimpanzee databases to choose from, 2 of which are incomplete. The complete ones also have different base pair lengths. Now, if we take the smallest base pair count of the human genomes and compare it to the largest of the chimp genomes, the chimp genome is almost 20% longer than the human. But let's go with what you said. Let's use the smallest chimp database and compare it to the largest human database. We calculate that the human DNA is some 16% longer than the chimp DNA. So, as you can see, it depends on how you use your data. I was going by what the evolutionist consensus was over the years, so your argument is with them, not me. But let's take your claim a little further. Let's say that the human DNA is 16% longer than the chimpanzee DNA, and I was completely wrong on my facts. You still missed my point. My point was that they were not the same length. How can chimp DNA and human DNA be 98.4% identical if the human DNA is 16% longer than the chimps? You have a math problem. So contrary to what you may think, I'm not avoiding discussion of genetics. I think genetics provides some of the most powerful evidence against evolution and affirming intelligent design. A crude comparison is to that of a computer program. Computer programs do not arise without an intelligent designer. Now, the reason this is a crude comparison is because, as you know, genetic programs are far, far more complicated. The program contains the instructions on how to build, maintain, and power the computer from elements in the environment. The programming code is written in multiple languages using the same lines of code. Our best minds on planet Earth struggle to dissect and understand it. Yet you want to argue that this program came about by unguided natural processes. With respect, it would be easier to explain the Windows operating system arising by unguided processes. Now, as a geneticist, you get to look into the programming itself. Just like the Windows operating system has all the hallmarks of its creator written into that code, it's like you are reverse engineering this complex operating system, only to deny that it even had a creator. You need to ask yourself, why? Because I'm convinced that it isn't because you would rationally deduce that from the genetic code. Like a computer program, it could not have happened without outside intelligence. Thanks for writing in. All right, I have to call that a wrap. I'm Ian Juby signing off for now, and I hope you'll join me again next Genesis Week. You can send us your comments, questions, hate mail, and the keys to your apartment in Venice to us in a number of ways. Remember those words of warning and comfort from our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me." We'll see you next week.
We are a viewer-supported program and need your support to keep this program on the air. Please pray for us, and if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, K2K 2P4. While we cannot offer tax-deductible receipts outside of Canada, donors wishing to financially support the program can do so online at ianjuby.org/donations, and thank you for your support.